Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's edition, a Monday. It is the 22nd day of December. We are into Christmas week. This will be our only time together this week at the Virtual Center. And so I'm hoping that we can make it one that will kind of keep people anxiously waiting for the next program, which, if everything goes right, will be a week from today on next Monday of New Year's week. It is the 22nd day of December in the year 2014. This is Bill O'Brien. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a pleasure to be with you. We will have our full 2 hours of programming today. I invite you to participate actively in the program by sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us, with all of us, not just me, but all the other folks that are tuned in. And I invite you to respond if indeed somebody does tune in. I hope that others of you will feel comfortable enough to respond and react to that call. We really appreciate hearing from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676, which translates into HORN, H-O-R-N. So again, if you're inclined that way, it would be 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. I include the IEN when I give that email address so often that if I don't think correctly, I assume that's part of the address. waobrien906. It's not that. It's waobrien906@gmail.com. We have an abbreviated week this week, as I mentioned. I will be doing some traveling. My wife and I are taking off early tomorrow morning and heading into New England. I think we're probably asking for it, but we really don't have much choice. My wife has a son in the military who is going to be deploying right after the holidays for 18 months. And so if she has to walk, she's going to get to New England this holiday season. So especially since he won't, but the way it's looking now, he won't even be available next Christmas. So we are looking forward to this. And he has 3 little girls and who don't know anything about the deployment. So my job in the few days that I'm going to be up there over the holidays is to keep my mouth shut and not blow the cover to the girls that their daddy is being deployed. But anyway, we're both looking forward to it. To be very honest with you, my wife and I are actually looking forward to the time that we'll spend together in the car. We for a number of different reasons, her job and my preparations here, and grandchildren that have been visiting us over the last couple of weekends and things. We really don't have a whole lot of time together, my wife and I, of late. So we're really looking forward to the idea that for 10 or 12 hours we'll be kind of together in the car, and hopefully if we don't actually start to exchange blows before we get out of the car in New England, we'll really enjoy the trip. We're looking forward to it. And let me, because once I get into the material here, I usually kind of lose track of time. So let me take this opportunity to wish all of you out there in the Horn family, all of you tuned into the Virtual Center, and those of you who regularly are participants in the programming here at the Virtual Center. I want to wish you all a very, very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and hopefully I'll be seeing you be back together again before New Year's. But I hope you just have a wonderful Christmas. It's a wonderful time to let those that you care most about know just how much you do care. It means a lot. And again, I hope that your holiday season is a joyous one, a safe one. I hope that you are able to maximize your time with those you love. And that's really what the holiday season is all about. That's really what life itself ought to be all about. But we know that it seems like there are certain drawbacks and barriers to creating that kind of a world. It's ironic that actually this is one of the issues that I'd like to address today at the Virtual Center, is that particular issue. But that's for later in the program. Again, we would love to hear from you. Our phone, again, the phone number, area code 304-663-HORN, HORN. Just a couple of updates. I was privileged to receive an email from a listener who was kind enough to forward this. This won't take long, but I think we've made mention of this before, but I just wanted to do it again since it continues to be republished. And this is the idea that there is a movement in the state of Texas to actually move forward with the idea of nullification. There is actually a proposal that will be introduced in the Texas legislature to create a 14, apparently from the way this reads, to create a 14-member joint legislative committee on legislation that will be appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor, the two of them. And this 14-member joint legislative committee on legislation will be given the authority within the state of Texas to nullify legislation that they disagree with. To quote specifically what the legislation says, to temporarily declare that any federal law they disagree with has no legal effect in this state, unquote. And again, we know that the nullification situation came up well before the Civil War in the early 19th century, principally from the mind and the pen of one John C. Calhoun. It was a very, very sophisticated rationalization for the idea of nullification. And I think it's a very important consideration because it suggests that there is still quite a bit of hostility to the constitutional authority given to the federal government, and more specifically to the president, to the office of the president. And of course, it's very interesting. Prior to President Obama's administration, the previous president for 8 years was of course from Texas, George W. Bush. And I think it's very interesting to note that there was no move within the state of Texas toward nullification while George Bush was in the White House. And one has to wonder how much of this is philosophical and ideological and how much of this is personal. And to be very honest with you, perhaps a little bit racist as well. So I did want to share that with you. I want to thank the person who sent me the link on that particular piece, because obviously Gene, who was responsible for sending me that link, obviously believed that since it dealt with nullification of federal legislation, it obviously probably would be of interest here at the Virtual Center. And I appreciate Gene doing that, and I want to thank you. This particular issue that I'd like to spend a few moments on before we get into back into the sanity of the 18th century as opposed to the insanity of the 21st. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but sometimes I really, as I read and watch the news, sometimes I really believe that this is true. One of the issues that obviously is getting so much attention of late, besides diplomatic relations with Cuba, the president's proposal to do so. And of course, you know that already there is all sorts of indications that the new Republican majority in the Senate, along with the Republican majority in the House, are threatening to do everything they can to make sure that recognition doesn't really happen when it comes to getting an ambassador to Cuba appointed and approved through the United States Senate. There is obviously a lot of opposition to that. So we don't really know how that's going to go yet. All of that will take place in the middle of January, so we have a couple of weeks to go. Right now, of course, we're in the at least much of the nation is caught up in the euphoria of the anticipated opening up of relations with Cuba and what that might mean, not only in terms of business, and of course we know we're already getting indications that America's financial institutions as well as its business institutions are lining up in order to take advantage of the potential opening of the Cuban market and the lifting of the blockade, which requires congressional action. So again, we really don't know how that's going to go. But except for that issue, the Cuban issue, the other issue that seems to be getting, well, I'm overstating here because it just dawned on me that the situation with the assassination of the 2 New York police officers is obviously an issue of major concern as well. But one of the issues over the last week that has been getting a lot of attention nationally is the Sony production situation, the hacking of Sony, presumably by North Korea or at the instigation of the North Korean government. At least that's the conclusion of the FBI and the CIA. And we don't know. The president has taken a position in news conferences in recent days, has taken a position and said that the United States will respond appropriately to this hacking. The president was reluctant, was unwilling to label it terrorism. However, he did call it vandalism, and said that the United States would respond, appropriately. And of course, though there are those within the United States, I'm thinking specifically of Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina yesterday morning, appeared on the Sunday talk shows and took issue with the president's characterization of the North Korean hacking into Sony's website, Sony's computer network, as being merely vandalism, that rather, according to Lindsey Graham, it's out-and-out terrorism and ought to be dealt with as such. And so we're beginning to see that it just doesn't seem to matter. I was going to make a sarcastic comment and say our two-party system is alive and well, in that it seems like every time the president takes a position on anything, there is an opposition. However, the fact of the matter is, as we know, our two-party system is not alive and well at all. It may be alive, but how well is, it seems to me, is questionable. But be that as it may, there seems to be a general consensus from the White House as well as from most of the commentators and most of the articles that I've read on the Sony not to release the movie, The Interview, under apparent threats, if you will, from North Korea of potential violence. There's a perspective on this that I haven't heard talked about too much. There was an article last week in the Washington Post dated December 18th. So it was 4 or 5 days ago. And the general perspective of this article raised a perspective that I hadn't heard or seen raised anywhere else. It's the one that I've been waiting for today's program, because it's the one that I kept waiting for and it never came. And so I thought that I would take a few moments, at least at the beginning of our program today here at the Virtual Center, and raise this issue. It's obviously raises serious issues, constitutional issues. This issue of hacking and the role of the government and hacking into private corporations like Sony, and what this might mean internationally and various other ways. I think all of us need to take seriously the president's position, which I think is, if you think about it, is rather legitimate, that he really was critical of Sony for making the decision not to release the movie, the interview, as basically giving in to the threats, to foreign threat, to terrorist threats. And his position, and I think it's one that all of us need to take seriously, is that this sets a precedent where we are letting forces and interests outside the United States dictate how the United States will respond and how corporate America will respond to international threats of terrorism. In effect, we are letting forces in dictatorships outside the United States dictate censorship within the United States. And the president's position is we can't give in to that. We can't condone that because it doesn't set a good precedent, and if you think about it, indeed it doesn't. However, I would like to introduce this into the equation. And that is the nature of the movie, the interview itself. There seems to be a general consensus that the content of the movie really doesn't have any role to play in the decisions surrounding it. That in a sense, the issue is over the right of the North Koreans to hack into the computer network of a large corporation like Sony. And then the debate as to whether in fact Sony ought to give in to the threats of terrorism if the movie is not pulled or not. Most accounts of this issue will make mention of the content of the movie. But I have been waiting in vain for anyone to make a connection between the content of the movie and the actions which followed. The inference to this silence seems to suggest a general consensus that it doesn't matter what the movie was about. Sony had the right to produce it because, and again, you can come up with a number of different reasons, because of the rights of artistic freedom, the rights of corporate freedom, the fact that we do not practice censorship in this country because we have freedom of the press and freedom of assembly and freedom of discussion and freedom of speech. In other words, all of the things that make the non-release of this movie under pressure discomforting. These are constitutional issues, all of them. But they are constitutional issues under our Constitution. I would suggest to you it's a little bit extreme to assume that other nations, especially hostile nations like North Korea, are going to respect the internal rights of our constitutional system. I think that's the first thing. However, there's no question that government's responsibility to defend the rights of Sony in this particular case do conform to people's general sense of constitutional obligations to protect constitutional freedoms in this republic. I'm wondering if there isn't any sense of responsibility here for the content of the movie. Specifically, for those of you who may not know, I think most folks by now do, the basic theme of the movie was that two independent journalists, were granted an audience, an interview opportunity with the president of North Korea. And as they were making preparations to go over there to conduct this interview, they receive instructions from the CIA to take the opportunity that they would be given of a private audience with President Jong-un to assassinate him. Most of the focus, most of the attention has been on North Korea's presumed. I'm assuming that the accusations and the suggestions that North Korea is behind this hacking are legitimate. And if I'm wrong, so be it. But that's not the point. The point is that the North Korean government clearly responded to this movie because of the content. But on the other hand, we have chosen to respond to North Korea's response irrespective of the content. I would suggest to you there's something a little bit disturbing about the suggestion of the film, namely the assassination of the head of another government in the world. To assume that that particular nation would not respond to a movie built around the theme of assassination of its own leader seems to me a little bit naive. I guess the question I'm asking is the content of this film, in your mind, inappropriate? It is labeled as a comedy. I would suggest to you there's not a whole lot funny about the assassination of anybody by anybody. So I'm wondering if there's a little bit of responsibility here on both sides. The unwillingness or lack of attention to this particular perspective about the content of the movie. The fact that nobody, I take that back. There was one piece in the Washington Post, which I will get to in a moment, that did take this seriously. But it's the only one that I've seen. And the fact of the matter is, I have heard a lot of people in conversation with me have mentioned that they didn't think the content of the movie, the theme of the movie, was very appropriate. It was kind of asking. I heard one person make the comment and said, it's kind of asking for it. how would we respond if there was a film being released in Russia or somewhere that was built on the theme of the assassination of our president? At minimum, we would be offended. Now, whether we would hack into the system of the company that produced it, that's another issue.
Hey,
But
Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob?
I just wanted to jump in on this for a second because, once again, you have managed to cut right to the heart of the matter. In point of fact, and we were discussing this on the program the other night, there was a film, 2006 maybe? Mm-hmm. It was called The Assassination of a President, and you may even recall it.
I don't really.
It was a British film, and it dealt with the assassination of George W. Bush.
Okay.
And the right-wing outcry could be heard a million light years from here.
Yes.
How dare they?
Yes.
So I don't think we have to speculate on the nature of that question.
No, I think Bob, I really do believe it's a very serious question. If we're going to begin to make any kind of inroads into ameliorating some of the issues that are causing the world such angst today, then we're going to have to become a little bit more self-policing and not do the kinds of things that inflame. You know, for example, we jump all over the world of Islam because we feel they overreact to these cartoons about Muhammad and these kinds of things. We overreact when anybody else does this, but when we do it, it's not even within the realm of discussion.
Oh, no, it's free speech.
It's free speech. And
but,
the assumption is...
But wait, if I could, and I don't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
If we're going... You remember how with the Ferguson grand jury everybody was talking about ham sandwiches? Mm-hmm. Well, when we talk about free speech, everybody talks about yelling fire in a crowded theater. Because that's an image we can all get our minds around. You know, a theater has, a whole bunch of people in it and only a few exits, and there's no way everybody can get through them at once.
Right.
Okay? So to yell fire in a crowded theater is, by definition, to create a very, very dangerous level of chaos.
Right.
And American law, Anglo-American jurisprudence, recognizes such conduct as incitement. Mm-hmm. If there is no fire in the theater and someone yells fire just to get a jolly out of watching people stampede each other, then we recognize that as an abuse of any sort of notion of free speech. Mm-hmm. I think that's fairly clear. Mm-hmm. So, and in fact, I remember last week, or maybe the week before, I played a clip of some Tea Party patriots protesting outside the White House, screaming, "Get a rope, there's plenty of trees around here, he won't be the first one of those to hang from a tree." Yeah. Okay? Oh, yeah. And okay. The he they were talking about was the President of the United States of America.
Right. Right.
Well, if we recognize, and this is something that I think deserves considerable discussion and sober reflection. If we are going to say that it is a criminal violation of the right of free speech within a community to yell fire in a crowded theater, and we understand that as incitement, then how is making a movie promoting the idea of the assassination of some other country's leader, whether we like him or not?
Exactly.
Okay, how is that not incitement, especially when it is it's a little isolated country that manages, one of the reasons North Korea stays alive is because it fosters this notion among the rest of the world that they're crazy, mm-hmm. and that they'll just do anything. when the fact of the matter is they're hanging on by a hair. And the only way they continue to hang on is by fostering that notion that they're insane. Because, I mean, just by way of comparison, for instance, you hear all the right-wingers hooting and hollering about Iran getting nuclear weapons. I don't think Iran is crazy.
No.
I think Iran is surrounded by people with nuclear weapons. Israel, Pakistan, India, and Saudi Arabia could pick up the phone and tell the United States to nuke Iran, and we would, because we obey Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So they're scared, but they're not crazy. On the other hand, North Korea has nuclear weapons, and they use that as a trump card, coupled with the fact that we think they're crazy, to extract their own continued existence and occasional concessions, particularly from the West.
Right.
Now, again, going back to my thesis, if it is incitement and a violation of ideas of free speech, criminal ideas of free speech, to yell fire in a crowded theater, how is it not criminal to deliberately incite a nuclear power?
Right.
At the same level? Because for all intents and purposes, Seth Rogen and the rest of the people at Sony that produced this film were yelling fire in a crowded North Korean theater.
That's exactly what they were doing. And what gets me, Bob, is the idea of civic responsibility. That it seems to me that while we obviously value the idea of free speech, the whole idea is it's not absolutely free. It's not. I mean, the fire in the crowded theater is an example of the fact that there are responsibilities associated with this freedom. And we have chosen in this particular situation to ignore the responsibilities by not even addressing the offensive nature of the content of that film to the North Koreans. We don't have a right to do that and expect no response. So in a sense, by the mere theme of the movie itself, we are the initiators of this whole business, not North Korea. The production of that movie, it seems to me. And when we talk about studying the Constitution and civic responsibility, part of civic responsibility is to recognize that while we value the freedoms that go with living under this constitutional system, there is also responsibility associated with those freedoms. John Winthrop was very, very specific in the 17th century that the idea of liberty being the right to do whatever you want and whenever you want to do it is not liberty in a civilized situation. It's the same kind of freedom, he made the point, it's the same kind of freedom that the beasts of the forest have. But civil responsibility is to recognize that you have the rights, you have freedoms to do certain things, but there are other things you do not have freedoms to do. And that's what this film is about. And I'm disappointed in the in the Obama administration's unwillingness to see this. I mean, this idea that you spring to the defense of corporate America, no matter what corporate America does, whether it's responsible or not, it seems to me is inane and very, very dangerous.
Yeah, well, I was going to say it's more dangerous than inane.
Yeah.
And can I point out one more thing? Because I know you've got stuff you want to get on.
No, that's okay. No, that's good. No problem.
We're not going to talk like this for another week or so, and I miss our little conversations.
Let's go.
Can we talk for just a moment about you mentioned Sony being a behemoth corporation. Talk about that for a second. I saw, and Sony is a behemoth corporation. Jesus, I think they make everything from pencil sharpeners to computers to televisions to bad movies about assassinating North Korean leaders.
That's right.
They also do music. Unless I'm completely mistaken, Sony absorbed what we used to know as Columbia Records. You remember that That unforgettable logo in the middle of a vinyl record album, the little stick with the oblongs, the ovoids emerging out from it, or were they parabolas or who knows? I failed geometry.
Yeah.
That's Sony now. And I wonder if there's also and see, Sony Motion Pictures is only one department of a gigantic juggernaut behemoth of a corporation.
That's right.
I had someone that I really trust about computers explain to me once that no one, even at the highest levels of Microsoft, no one knows everything about how Windows works.
Okay.
And the same probably applies to iOS Fruit Bat or whatever Apple's doing now.
Right.
Nobody knows how it all works. And I think we can apply that same notion to corporations.
Right.
Just and watch this. You have taught me so well. I'm so proud of myself. And just as the framers wondered if a big republic could actually survive merely because of its size,
right?
I wonder if there is some sort of organizational or structural law that obtains with a corporation. For instance, the question is, would Columbia Records have been hacked like this if it were a smaller corporation that could devote more resources to just doing what it does? Because remember, in the days of the framers, a corporation was put together for a specific purpose. You know, the charter for the Jamestown colony was for the specific purpose of founding a colony.
That's right.
What was it? The East India Company.
And John Marshall's defense of corporations was based on the idea that they literally exist to serve a public interest of some kind. That there's some need that they fulfill.
Right, and that even translates down into the early 20th century, Dr. Bill, in the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act.
Exactly. And you raise an issue, Bob, which I think is incredible. And it is the idea that in our contemporary corporations like Sony, they are so diverse that it may not be possible to even assume that there's any kind of corporate responsibility, because there's no place where corporate decisions are made covering everybody.
Right.
And so in a sense, what we've done is we've created a multi-headed monster that nobody can control.
Exactly.
And you're right, that's what the founders believed, the critics of the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists believed, if you try to unite all of the 13 colonies under one government, that you'll have so many competing interests.
Well, we talked
chaos.
We talked on my program last week, I think, about the fact that democracy appears to work at some level in Vermont. It appears to work in New Hampshire. It appears to work in Massachusetts, and compared to Vermont or New Hampshire, Massachusetts is huge, even though it's tiny.
Yeah, right.
But take notice that the minute the United States becomes something other than those 13 original states, the minute that Maine comes in, the minute that Kentucky comes in, the minute that Tennessee comes in, the states start getting larger. That impulse to keep things relatively small you see at work in before there was ever an Alabama or a Mississippi, there was a Mississippi Territory, and that was just an extension. The northern boundary of which was Georgia. That was just an extension of Georgia, the same way that Tennessee was an extension of North Carolina.
Right.
And you get that impulse to keep things at least moderately small when the Mississippi Territory, instead of entering the Union as one state, enters the Union as Mississippi and Alabama.
Right.
But the minute you cross the Mississippi River, it's like all bets are off, and suddenly you get behemoth states like Texas, we don't really. But my God, the size of Montana.
Yeah.
And then California, and wow. And I think those are American historical political manifestations of the same thing that we are letting happen on a corporate level. If we had a fully functioning government that was paying attention to things like the framers or the arguments of the anti-federalists or the Sherman Antitrust Act, there's no way that you can wind up with a Sony, okay? And
right.
And then, and of course there are transnational aspects to this as well, Dr. Bill.
Uh-huh.
Because Sony is headquartered in Tokyo, and Japanese sensibilities and Japanese political decisions are considerably different from American ones, and they have a much different attitude toward North Korea than we do. We think, North Korea can't touch us. Well, somebody in Tokyo doesn't think that way.
Doesn't think that. No, you bet.
But still, Sony in Tokyo was not big enough or strong enough or cognizant enough to realize that back here in the United States, they were contemplating a movie,
right?
A buddy road film comedy about murdering
the leader of North Korea.
Yeah, not the fictional leader.
Which is right across the straits from Tokyo.
Bingo.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, what this, it seems to me, what this whole situation reveals is a total lack of corporate responsibility. We're talking about one of the issues that's on the table today is the issue of corporate responsibility and whether, in fact, corporations have a responsibility to give back, to do something for the community that gives rise to them. But in effect, what we're seeing here is an absolute absence of any sense of corporate responsibility, and we're seeing governments spring to the defense of the corporations under First Amendment freedoms that don't mean anything in this situation. And I think that this whole side of the issue needs to be on the table before people start to reach conclusions.
Right, and once again, we've got a story that's sucking all the oxygen out of the room. And it's the Sony story, and I've given it a lot of thought. I really, really have. I feel silly for thinking this, for investing the amount of brain power I have, such as I have, into such an inane, ignorant, stupid premise of a movie. Mm-hmm. But I've come to the conclusion that Sony's rights to commit what are, in fact, acts of intentional international incitement is not a free speech hill that I'm going to go fight on.
No. And in fact, the only way that you can not consider the content of this film in reaching a conclusion about the whole issue of the hacking is to assume that this is an artistic adventure and not a political one. And the comment you've just made suggests that it's clearly political. It's not just an effort at humor. It clearly has political ramifications. And those who made the film knew that it had those implications and ramifications. And they did it anyway. And they're basically, by not addressing the content of the film, they are in a sense trying to avoid assuming any kind of responsibility for what they did. And the fact of the matter is they knew what they were doing. This particular piece that I referred to in the Washington Post last week had a couple of those emails that were released in the hacking which indicate that the Rand Corporation had previewed this film and had made the recommendation, had made the comment that one of the things we know is that the best way to begin to get a ball rolling to eliminate a dictator, like the dictator involved in this case, is to make the suggestion like this in somewhat of an innocent venue, which would be a movie. In other words, they knew damn well that they were acting politically when they produced this film, but they did it anyway, and now they're claiming artistic license and suggesting that our government ought to do something about North Korea, because North Korea has
well,
taken issue with their freedom.
Consider the irony in that, because the very of course, I haven't seen the film, but I did sit. I sat in a movie and watched in a movie theater and watched the trailer for it, and looked at my son and said, "Well, there's 16 of my dollars Sony's never going to get," because it looked like a dog from the gut from Jump. But it is supremely ironic that the premise of the film is that the CIA goes to these, and they're not really journalists. They're like Entertainment Tonight people. They're not, they're not real journalists. They're just.
Right. I know what you mean. Yeah, they're entertainers first.
Right. It goes to them and says, we want, because everybody's seen that scene because it's in the trailer. We want you to take out the leader of North Korea. And the two dummies say, like to dinner? No, take him out. Like to a movie? No, take him out.
Yeah.
And how fascinating that the premise of the movie would be echoed by the Rand Corporation as an actual expression of what the public policy of the United States of America should be. Because we have laws against assassinating other countries' leaders.
Exactly.
And we have those laws because we recognize that we don't want other countries coming and trying to assassinate ours.
Right. And the whole effort to assassinate Fidel Castro nobody's raised this issue during this whole thing about recognizing Cuba. That in effect we did indeed try to assassinate Fidel Castro years and years ago.
Oh yeah, let's see, the poisoned skin diving suit, the poisoned cigars.
Yeah, absolutely stupid stuff.
The CIA did it. It has to be stupid.
Bob, the Daily Beast, printed communications between. This is the chief executive of Sony Entertainment, Michael Linton, in conjunction with the Rand Corporation. In June, 6 months ago, Bruce Bennett, a defense analyst for Rand, wrote to Linton, the chief executive of Sony Entertainment, and this is the quote: "I have been clear that the assassination of Kim Jong-un is the most likely path to a collapse of the North Korean government. Thus, while toning down the ending, presumably the ending of the movie, may reduce the North Korean response, I believe that a story that talks about the removal of the Kim family regime and the creation of a new government by the North Korean people, well, at least by the elites, will start some real thinking in South Korea and, I believe, in the North, once the DVD leaks into the North, which it almost certainly will," unquote.
And see, so I saw that.
The Rand Corporation. Good God!
I saw that, Bill, and I double checked to make sure I wasn't looking at the Onion.
Yeah.
Because isn't that just exactly what we want? A North Korea as a leaderless state,
right,
with God knows who in charge of what, 5, 6? How many's enough? 7, 8 nuclear weapons?
Right.
Yeah, that's what we want. That state that we have no way of reaching into, descending into chaos. Isn't that the reason that we have in point of fact shored up and stood behind and tolerated God knows how many abuses of human rights? Well, while we were committing them ourselves, of course, but that's another story. From Pakistan. We don't want a chaotic Pakistan because we're afraid that somebody will get hold of somebody will
have the button.
Yeah.
Be able to push the button.
Who might actually think that would be a fun thing to do.
And what we accomplished during the Bush administration in the Middle East was to take out what stability there was in the Middle East, and now we've got a Middle East that's seemingly out of control. Or at least portions of it are out of control.
Yeah, because we did that. Now, we manually and intentionally sank Iraq into chaos when Iraq, it turns out, was actually the country that was kind of keeping everybody's hands off of everybody else's throats.
Right.
Because as long as miserable as it may be, as long as you had that dynamic tension between Iraq and Iran, both of whom were exhausted by their war against each other, who didn't want another war again, but could continue to just sort of hate each other quietly, then everything else stayed, tamped down a little bit. And
yeah.
And well, thank you, Mr. Bush. Look what you did. Aren't you proud?
Yep. And so I mean, we've done that, and basically the message, if you take the two situations and put them side by side, the implication seems to be that we're much more comfortable with chaos than we are with somebody that doesn't buy into our ideological
or that we
priorities.
We have a certain political class whose mindset is that they rather enjoy chaos because there's money to be made out of it.
Yeah. Oh, Bob. And just one thing, Linton responded to that particular email from Bennett and said, and I find this really juicy. He said, Bruce spoke to someone very senior in state confidentially. He agreed with everything you've been saying, everything. I will fill you in when we speak, unquote. This was an exchange of emails in June. So we knew what the content of this movie was about, and we consciously endorsed it. And for now to react because North Korea reacted, it seems to me is unconscionable. And I think people need to know that it happened. And I've been checking the national media. I've been looking at New York Times and LA Times and Chicago Tribune and Washington Post and everything else. And I can't find anybody that's picked this up other than this particular piece that was in the Washington Post on the last Wednesday on the 18th of the month. So, I think.
And I was going to say, if I may, Dr. Bill,
go ahead, Bob.
that this being your only program of the week, and there being one other thing on the table, I don't know if you'd planned to go into this, but I think if you were able to bring it, maybe in the next hour, bring your formidable skills to bear on the editorial from the New York Times today. Have you seen it?
I'm not sure that I did, Bob. I read a number of things, but.
Prosecute torturers and their bosses. This is the editorial board of the New York Times yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And they're calling for the investigation and prosecution by a special prosecutor of the people, and it looks like they say go all the way up.
Right. Wow. No, I missed that.
And here's a when you sit and play cards, play poker especially, there are these things you know what a tell is, right?
Yeah.
Well, the tell in this editorial is that immediately underneath the, at least on the online version, immediately underneath the headline, prosecute torturers and their bosses, they chose to display a photograph of Richard B. Dick Cheney.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they cite President Obama saying we need to look forward as opposed to looking backwards.
Not back. Yeah, exactly.
They cite that, but then they build a pretty damning case in favor, and they name names.
Right.
Cheney, David Addington is chief of staff.
Right.
George Tenet, John Yoo, Jay Bybee, Jose Rodriguez Jr., and the two psychologists who, with no skill in it whatsoever, devised the torture regimen.
Right. So we know who to go after. It's just the political will to go after them.
Right. And meanwhile, a German commission has filed charges with respect, if I read this correctly, with respect to Cheney's ordering of torture, because a German citizen was one of the people that we picked up, by mistake and tortured by mistake for months and months and months and months. And even after we learned that we were torturing him by mistake, we didn't turn him loose because we'd been torturing him by mistake.
Right. Oh my. Bob, I thought this was 10 to 15-minute issue, but it clearly was
Well,
not.
I didn't mean to hijack the program.
Hey, listen, I was going to mention that the Daily Beast stuff that came out of this, and the fact that there was clearly politics associated. This was the use of the arts for political ends, and those behind it knew they were doing it. And for the president to spring to the defense of Sony, well, as if this had happened in a vacuum, and there was some sort of responsibility of the North Korean government to adhere to our constitutional First Amendment freedoms, is absurd.
Wow, when you put it that way, it is pretty silly, isn't it?
It's absurd,
and
it speaks volumes about why we don't seem to be getting anywhere internationally.
And the Supreme Court has wrestled with this. Justice Potter Stewart famously said in regard to obscenity, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
And various courts have employed standards like having absolutely no redeeming social, artistic, creative, cultural, or political value.
Right.
When talking about when speech via art may be suppressed.
Right, Bob.
And that's I don't think you can say that about the interview. I don't think you can say it has no. I'm sure there are some funny moments in it.
Yeah.
Because I'm told that Seth Rogen is a funny person.
Yeah, the concept, I mean, you can see where if you think about it, you can see, but it's not happening in the abstract. It's happening in a real world.
Well, and that real world is a very prickly, sensitive real world.
Thing.
Exactly. You mentioned the response of the Muslim world to pictures they deemed to cartoons that they deemed to be demeaning to the Prophet.
Right.
Well, I don't think we can talk about that, Dr. Bill, without talking about the absolute hysteria that went down in the American right over Robert Mapplethorpe.
Mm-hmm.
Right. What did he do? He suspended a crucifix in a jar of what he said was urine. Or there was the painting of the Madonna done in elephant poo.
Yeah.
And then there was the guy who who sculpted a life-size chocolate Jesus, but he didn't have a white chocolate loincloth on. And Bill O'Donohue from the Catholic League got his followers so riled up that the poor artist had to go into hiding because they were ready to kill him.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a prickly and hypersensitive world, and one wonders if. Because I'd like to know what the process was, Dr. Bill, because no movie just gets made. There's an idea and a pitch, and there are meetings around that, and then there's lunch, and have your people call my people, and then there's a what's it called, a treatment, and then there's storyboarding, and there are meetings all along this continuum. And apparently, at no point in time did anybody say to Seth Rogen, I don't know. And why? I don't know.
Well, it's probably true that that there probably wasn't the recognition that North Korea had the technological skill to accomplish what they did with this hacking. There's been reports since then about the number of hackers that the North Korean regime employs, whose job it is to do this. But the fact of the matter is, I'm kind of guessing that that if the issue of hacking into Sony's system had ever come up in any of these discussions, most of the people in the room would say, "Oh, North Korea doesn't have the capability of doing that." The fact of the matter is they have nuclear weapons, and
it's the nuclear weapons you ought to be thinking about, not the quality of their hackers.
Right. Well, Bob, the second issue that I was the second other issue that I was going to deal with today was quite a bit different. But actually, I think when we get into our second hour, I really think that the second issue the issue that I was going to propose today really needs to be considered in the context of this issue. Because I know, and I hadn't really intended to do that, but the more I think about it, I'm beginning to think that it's a little bit naive on my part to assume that these are separate issues, because all of these things are interconnected and interdependent.
Well,
but
shall we take our top of the hour break?
Let's take it. We're just a little bit beyond the top of the hour, so let's take a 4 or 5 minute break, and then we'll get back.
All right, and I'll stop hijacking the program.
You're doing fine, Bob. You're doing great. Hey, listen, thank you.
My pleasure, Bill.
Okay.
Happy Christmas.
Thank you, Bob. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We will be back for our second hour. We'll pause and take a 4 or 5 minute break, and we'll be right back. So if you are with us, please stay with us. We will not be gone long. Thank you.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here again is Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is Monday. It is the 22nd day of December. It is Christmas week, and again, I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity before we get into a subject that probably will take us right to the end of our program today and deny me time to express holiday Christmas goodwill and wishes to all of you that I do that now. So again, I hope you have a wonderful, safe Christmas. You get to enjoy maximum time with those that you love, and I hope that again, love is strengthened and respect is strengthened during this period, during this holiday season, to a degree that it will extend well beyond the holidays. That's, I think, the hope, the wish, the prayer that all of us have. So please enjoy, be safe, and we will be back here at the Virtual Center on next Monday, which will be the first day of New Year's week. Lord willing, if everything goes well, we will be back then. So again, Merry Christmas, enjoy, and again, thank you as we move toward the end of this year. Thank you for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network and for the support of the Virtual Center. I appreciate it. I know Bob Kincaid and his folks appreciate it as well. And my New Year's resolution, is to continue to seek and search for ways to remove a little bit of the financial restraints on all of us that would enable us to really make 2015 the year that the voice of the Head On Radio Network becomes louder and reaches into more corners of the world. I really hope that we're able to do that. If you would like to communicate directly with us here at the Virtual Center and share your thoughts and your ideas, concerns with our listeners, we have a phone number just for that purpose. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-HORN, HORN. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me, waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien906 at gmail.com. If you are just joining us, welcome to the Virtual Center. If you have been with us through the first hour, then you know that we got into, I think, a very rich discussion of an aspect of the Sony hacking situation over the movie The Interview that I really believe the nation needs to hear. I really believe that people need to understand and appreciate the responsibilities of the artist, in this case Sony, and not assume that all the liability and all the responsibility falls on the shoulders of North Korea, to assume that North Korea somehow must abide by America's First Amendment freedoms and the freedoms of creativity that we grant our corporations. The fact of the matter is, none of our freedoms are devoid of responsibility. We know that. And it seems to me that one of the issues which is too rarely talked about in our conversations in today's world is the issue of corporate responsibility. I can remember in the 1980s, I used to put together workshops for employers on corporate ethics and the responsibilities of corporations to adhere to standards of behavior that were commensurate with the standards that they expected their employees to adhere to. We don't hear about the issue of corporate ethics anymore, and I think one of the issues that came up, and Bob Kincaid raised it, and I think very advisedly raised it, is the size of some of our corporations, specifically the size of Sony. And the fact of the matter is, have our corporations become so large and so diverse that they are realistically devoid of any sense of corporate responsibility that we might choose to impose upon them? In other words, are they operating in an ethical vacuum? I would suggest that we can't afford to accept even that possibility. There is evidence, and I quoted an email that was printed in the Washington Post on the 18th that was released by the Daily Beast. And it was an exchange of emails from last June related to the making of the film, The Interview. And it was an exchange of emails between a defense analyst for Rand Corporation, Bruce Bennett, and the chief executive of Sony Entertainment, Michael Linton. And it dealt specifically with the content of this film, the content of The Interview, which again is the assassination. The focus is on the assassination of the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. And in June, and these emails are part of the hacking of Sony. These are part of the emails that nobody was supposed to see. Bruce Bennett of the Rand Corporation, in an email to Michael Linton of Sony, said the following: I have been clear that the assassination of Kim Jong-un is the most likely path to a collapse of the North Korean government. Thus, while toning down the ending, presumably the ending of the movie, The Interview, may reduce the North Korean response, because in other emails the question was raised of waking the sleeping dragon with the content of this movie. I believe that a story that talks about the removal of the Kim family regime and the creation of a new government by the North Korean people, well, at least by the elites in Korea, will start some real thinking in South Korea, and I believe in the North, once the DVD leaks into the North, which it almost certainly will, unquote. This suggests that 6 months before this hacking, there was already on the table the realization that this movie would accomplish clear political objectives of the United States in foreign policy. Namely, it would get the ball rolling in the process of getting rid of the Kim family in North Korea. In response to that email, Michael Linton sends the following to Bruce Bennett. Bruce, spoke to someone very senior in state confidentially. He agreed with everything you've been saying. Everything. I will fill you in when we speak. Unquote. Clearly, there was a realization 6 months before the fact that this movie had real, substantive, political implications. And for North Korea to respond to those implications should not shock us. It was anticipated 6 months before we went forward with this film. The issue, or an issue, that I wanted to introduce in today's program, because at this point it's just an amorphous cloud in my intellectual world, so to speak. But I thought I would share some honest thoughts that I've been having of late. I'm playing around with I've been playing around now for the last 4 or 5 days with the idea of taking on the writing of a book. And specifically, I'm thinking of a book that would revisit Benjamin Rush's essay written in the late 18th century, in the early 1790s, entitled On the Mode of Education Proper in a Republic. Based on our programs over the last couple of months, and some of the information and some of the substance that we've looked at in the Federalist Papers, in the Constitutional Convention, in the writings of the founders, it seems to me that we as a nation are really devoid of an updated effort to address the issue of what indeed constitutes the American Republic of the 21st century. I would suggest that in the 18th century, Benjamin Rush was addressing the issue of republicanism from the perspective of theory, principally the theories of Republican government as articulated by Montesquieu in his Spirit of the Laws. But it's very clear that the nature of the Republic and the definition of civic responsibility within that Republic of the 21st century needs to be redefined. So in a sense, it seems to me, what I've been looking at is the possibility of putting together a book with a double focus. An effort to define much more precisely the ingredients of republicanism that will be necessary in the 21st century in order to fulfill the ideals of the founders in their advocacy of the creation of Republican government in the 18th century. In other words, to update, modernize, if you will, the thinking of the founders in the way they defined the nature of Republican government, more specifically, the way that they looked at the responsibility of citizens within that republic. And then the second aspect of this would be the kind of education necessary to successfully prepare citizens to fulfill the civic responsibilities associated with a contemporary republic, the republic anticipated and envisioned by the founders. It would obviously be rather idealistic, but it seemed to me that in the course of putting together such a study, it would necessitate bringing forward for reconsideration by the citizens at large the thinking of the founders in terms of what it is they wanted and what they believed we would have to do in order to achieve it. I have to be honest. The discussion that we had in our first hour today over the North Korean hacking of Sony Entertainment in response to the movie The Interview, and the pressure put on Sony Entertainment to withhold release of the movie, and the response that that has engendered on the part of President Obama and American politicians on either side of the aisle, this whole discussion that we had in our first hour seems to create almost a third focus in the projection of such a study. Not only would it have to address the issue of a republic as envisioned by the founders as it would operate in the 21st century, not only would it have to include the nature or the definition of civic education that would be necessary into properly preparing citizens to fulfill their citizen obligations in such a republic. But clearly, there's also an issue of realism associated here along with this idealism. And that is the very real nature of what we're dealing with in contemporary 21st century American society. The fact that with the exception of those of us here at the Horn, at the Head On Radio Network and the Virtual Center, who are looking at the liability and the responsibility associated with the content of this film, the fact that we are the only ones even raising these issues suggests that there's a very real element of arrogance and insensitivity toward the rest of the world that is being reflected not only in our artistic community, not only in Sony Entertainment, but also amongst our political leaders and amongst our educational leaders as well. There's no question that the debates in today's world on the issue of education in the 21st century are revolving around the idea of the Common Core standards. And we know that the initial optimism and enthusiasm about these standards, which caused upwards of 45 states to endorse the Common Core standards at the outset, has since then resulted in a number of these states trying to withdraw their support for the common standards, or drawing a line in the sand and outright refusing to adhere to these standards. And the fact that in defense of this hostility toward this latest effort at educational reform in America, people are coming up with all sorts of sometimes real, but at other times I would argue inane issues to rationalize or justify their opposition to the Common Core. It is my belief that the real basis of opposition to the Common Core is based on the promise of real substantive change that the Common Core involves. It doesn't mean that change from the Common Core standards will happen. It merely means that real substantive change with adoption of the Common Core could happen. And I'm beginning to believe that the possibility of such change is really what is driving the opposition to the adoption of these standards. And this would take us back to Benjamin Rush's Mode of Education Proper in a Republic, written in 1792. Because what Benjamin Rush was talking about was an educational system for preparing citizens for citizenship in a republic, which for lack of a better term involve pure rote. What we were talking about in the late 18th century, what the founders were talking about, and I'm including Benjamin Rush in the context of one of the founders because indeed clearly he was a basic belief of the time that was articulated so clearly by Alexander Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention that indeed all communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The few are the rich and well-born, the many is the mass of the people. And Rush's assumptions that reality of the nature of community suggested that in order to hold those two elements, the few and the many, together in community, it was necessary to educate the few to lead and educate the many to follow. And an education focused principally on the need to follow, by definition, is an education that cannot involve the search for truth, but indeed must involve the memorization of truth, must involve the indoctrination of the young into the truth. And I would suggest that our entire educational system, as it has evolved since the late 18th century, is based on these same assumptions. That the purpose of education is to discover talent. And the only way successfully to gain access to all the available talent is to require everyone to experience the competitive environment of the classroom. And that in the process of imposing a very fixed, limited approach to truth within the classroom, we were in the process engaging in strategies designed through competition to enable talent to rise to the surface, allowing the cream to rise to the top. And then, to quote Jefferson, through periodic skimmings of this cream, society would gain access to the wisdom and the ability and the talents that existed within our society, even when those talents are not within the few, but happen to be within the many. It seems to me that the promise of the Common Core standards is to begin to change that. By taking away the idea that truth has already been discovered and turning students loose in the pursuit of truth through methods of reading and writing and analysis that would give them the opportunity to discover the talents and the abilities that already exist within themselves. This is the kind of exercise I would suggest that the few have traditionally been afraid of, have been unwilling to support. And I would contend that that unwillingness to support these kinds of educational efforts for all of our citizens, more than anything else, is what constitutes the opposition to the Common Core standards. And that all the reasons given, the fact that Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation supports them, is putting up big money to implement them, all of the things suggest that the people who support the Common Core standards is enough of itself to raise flags about the standards themselves. I would suggest all of that is diversionary, all of it is cover. But the fact of the matter is, in the study that I envision, the case would have to be made that the implications of the Common Core standards and the kind of education they imply is the stuff that constitutes the substance of citizen and civic education in the 21st century. If this republic is to succeed, is to survive, it seems to me we have got to involve all of our citizens in the pursuit of its objectives and in an appreciation of its ideals and its vision, so that all of us together are working in the same direction for the same outcomes. That is the study that I am envisioning undertaking. But one of the things that occurred to me during our first hour today is the reality that there's much more to it than the education of citizens and the ideals of the founders. And that is the reality of corporations and the lengths to which the few will go in order to prevent this kind of revised approach to Republican education and the civic responsibilities that go with it. It seems to me that involved in all of this is a serious effort to take on the issues of inequality, an effort to take on the realities that within our very corporate capitalist structure itself seem to be the ingredients of the kind of inequality that is causing so many of us so much angst. Specifically, taking the findings in the 600-page study done by Thomas Piketty looking at his data and dealing realistically with that data, dealing realistically with his suggestion that inequality is innate within capitalism itself, and that if we are going to make our republic successful, we have got to take on the level of inequality that exists in our society today. And in order to do that, we must take on capitalism. We must recognize capitalism for its strengths, and we must be willing to recognize those places in which we must deal with the elements of capitalism which work against our common purpose. I think last week in our programs, when we looked at this, at one piece we were dealing, if you remember, with the issue of slavery as being capitalistic, and the extent to which American slavery really served as the foundation for the development of industrialism in America, became the foundation, if you will, of the flourishing of capitalism in American society. One of the things we looked at in conjunction with that was the extent to which we were guilty of betraying some of the ideals of the wealth of nations. Some of the ideals of capitalist theory. And so basically, it seems to me, in order to make a study like this meaningful, we must take on the wealth of nations. We must take on capitalism. We must be willing to take on the elements of betrayal, the degree to which we have been comfortable in violating the essence of the theory that we claim to be adhering to so fervently and so completely. Anyway, what I wanted to do today as part of our program, especially with the holidays coming and the fact that we wouldn't be back together again for yet another week, is to throw out the ideals of this study and ask you for input. Because more than anybody else, those of you who have been regular participants in the virtual center over the weeks and months previous are best able to offer insight and direction and caution to such a study. Because there's not much that I would envision going into a study like this that hasn't been dealt with here at the virtual center, whether in fact it received serious attention and extended attention, or whether it received merely a mention or two. But I would argue that the people who are here at the virtual center on a regular basis have the ability and the wisdom to provide the kind of guidance that I'm soliciting. A couple of years ago, I started to work on a book. I worked on the preface to a book. And it was principally to be a study of economics itself. And I was working with an economist. But I came up short, and part of the reasons for that, I think, were that I really didn't have the passion for the substance that I was dealing with. It didn't seem to me that the objective of the study was clearly enough articulated. My goal was to take on the issue of inequality and to trace in the founders the issue of inequality and to come up with the explanation or the reasons as to why the rampant inequality that exists in our society today threatens the Republic. The study that I'm introducing here would incorporate that same issue, because I do believe that one of the realities of the Republic that we must deal with is the rampant inequality which seems to go hand in hand with capitalist development. We must be willing to take it on. We must be willing to recognize that civic responsibility and citizenship within a republic cannot function within a society that is engaging in the kind of inequality in the distribution of goods and services that we are witnessing in today's society and in today's world. And one of the things that the literature that's been done on slavery is beginning to reveal is the extent to which the nature of the global impact of the Industrial Revolution suggests the creation of a developed world and an undeveloped world as part of the Industrial Revolution. It's very clear that as the West developed, as the West experienced the Industrial Revolution and the development, the modernization that accompanied it, large portions of the world were excluded from that development. They became subservient, if you will, to the realities of the developed world. They became the providers of the natural resources and the potential markets of the goods and services produced in that world, in that developing world. In the global perspective of capitalism that developed during the 18th century especially, and in the early 19th century, a world that revolved principally on commerce, it became very clear that large portions of the world were not invited to participate in development as equal partners. It also becomes clear that the areas of the world that seemingly were excluded from economic development were those areas of the world that were rich in natural resources. The very availability of the resources in these areas of the world gave them a role to play in the economic development that we know as the Industrial Revolution. Their role was as a supplier of natural resources, not as a participant in economic development. And so consequently, the developed world developed in one direction, the undeveloped world developed in the other. And the way it was sold is to suggest that the availability of goods and services promised by an industrializing, developing world will improve the quality of life and standard of living in the rest of the world, which will become the consumers of the development produced. However, the degree to which inequality seems to define the relationship in capitalism between producers and consumers is the very same definition of inequality which we are experiencing in today's 21st century society here in the United States and throughout the world. In other words, that inequality is potentially the major barrier to the success of the Republic. Because the nature of the Republic envisioned by the founders cannot include the kind of class system which inequality in and of itself produces. It can't last. We saw in the early 19th century, we witnessed James Madison's explanation of why we had to make the vote, the suffrage, available to those growing numbers of people that didn't own the property required to meet property qualifications for voting and office holding. The only way that we could make people without property feel important and feel valued in the Republic was to provide them, give them access to the vote. Maybe the suffrage would become the psychological equivalent of property as the kind of vested interest necessary for full participation and full citizenship in the Republic. And the fact that it was none other than James Madison that was the spokesman for this change in the piece he wrote in 1829 seems to me to suggest that the founders themselves were already aware that the potential of industrialism was the potential for creating a large propertyless constituency. And the reality was that the Republic could not withstand a growing number of people who, because of what they didn't have, were not considered full participants in the society. Therefore, you had to find a way to make up for the property deficiencies with the suffrage. In effect, what Madison is saying to us is that in order for the Republic to make it, everybody has to be included within the idea of citizenship. Everybody has certain rights in this Republic as well as responsibilities in this Republic. The responsibilities of citizenship in Republican government. And so the issue then that confronts us is the issue of education. The education of trained clones that was defined by Benjamin Rush in the mode of education proper in the Republic he was talking about is not the kind of education that's going to make it possible to sustain the Republic of the 21st century. We are talking about revolutionary change in the way we educate our citizens. And part of that education, it seems to me, is the ability to make everybody aware of what the Republic entails and what the Republic requires and what the Republic promises, and how all of those are interrelated to each other. A republic cannot fulfill its promises unless its citizens are willing to assume the responsibilities of citizenship. And citizens are not going to be willing to accept the responsibilities of citizenship when they appear to be second-class citizens within the republic, based on the kinds of inequality that we see all around us. In a sense, and I'm thinking aloud here, so I haven't gone through all the analysis necessary to fill all the loopholes in this theory, and that's why I'm asking you for your input. I'm asking you to reflect over the next week on some of these issues so that when we get back together, you can help me and direct me and tell me where we're right and where we need to do some rethinking. But it seems to me that traditionally we have had the idea that the republic, in a sense, is kind of secondary to the economic system. Capitalism is the economy of the developing world, has been for a number of centuries. And republicanism is a form of government which theoretically needs to adjust to and accommodate the realities of capitalism. But what we're talking about here is something a little different. Because if the realities of capitalism are creating economic diversity in the nation and in the world, which make Republican government impossible, which makes the vision of the founders impossible, then I would suggest to you that the change necessary needs to be on the economic side, not on the political side, not on the ideological side. It's not the republic that needs to be adjusted and fixed. It's the economy. What we have to do is begin to see that the freedoms that we talk about all the time that are associated and which drive capitalism are not ends in themselves. The opportunities available to us in republicanism are. I would suggest to you that we need to begin to look at the economic system as a way to make our republic flourish, rather than manipulate the republic in order that we can continue to allow capitalism to flourish. Because capitalism is flourishing for only the few, while our political system talks about the rights of all. If we are to be successful in creating a political republic in which the rights of all are paramount, then we have got to make the kinds of economic changes necessary in order to support the goals and ideals of that republic. I would suggest to you that that is consistent with the vision of the founders. That's what they dreamed about. That's what they believed they were doing, is creating a political system that would allow a vibrant, growing community of free individuals to flourish. The Republic would allow that group to govern that community in ways which were conducive to all, not just to a few. So what we have here is a contradiction or a conflict, if you will, between the ideals of the few and the ideals of the many. I think citizen responsibility, civic education, if you will, is a key to making Republican government work. That's the study that I'm trying to, in my mind, clarify. I think I've got the content necessary to substantiate such a study. But organizing it and making sure that it all heads in the same direction and it all reaches the same conclusion at the end is perhaps the most difficult part. For that, I ask you, the audience out there in the virtual center, to assist me. Think about this. Think about the goals and the objectives, what a study like this would entail. And feel free to let me know. We'll be back together again on next Monday, the Monday of New Year's week. But you can email me anytime before then. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906@gmail.com. Let me know your thinking on this. Let me know what you think about the vision of the founders. I know that many of us believe and have learned, and indeed, in truth, are indeed correct, that the founders were members of the elite of the 18th century elite. They took certain things about society and the way that society needed to be organized for granted. They believed that in order for the political system to work, everybody had to become part of it. But they also believed that the vast majority of citizens, the masses so-called, needed to be educated in a way which would fit them more fully for peaceable government. That's almost a quote from Benjamin Rush. Educating the masses to fit them more peacefully, if you will, into republicanism. I think we've come a long way. We've learned a lot. And we realize that the ideals of the Republic suggest a different definition of citizenship and of the citizenry than existed at that time. I'm hoping to take that issue on. And I'm looking to you to help me do it. Again, my email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. I know that out there in the audience is one person, Bob Kincaid, who's going to give me his ideas on this, and I solicit them as well. We are at 59 minutes after the hour. We've reached the end of our program today. It is now 3 p.m. I want to thank you. Be safe. Have a wonderful Christmas. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.